Foreword. I have written extensive descriptive accounts of my apprentice relationship with a Mexican Indian sorcerer, Don Juan Matus. Due to the foreignness of the concepts and practices Don Juan wanted me to understand and internalize, I have had no other choice but to render his teachings in the form of a narrative of what happened, as it happened. The organization of Don Juan's instruction was predicated on the idea that man has two types of awareness. He labeled them the right side and the left side. He described the first as the state of normal awareness necessary for everyday life. The second, he said, was the mysterious side of man, the state of awareness needed to function as sorcerer and seer. Don Juan divided his instruction accordingly into teachings for the right side and teachings for the left side. He conducted his teachings for the right side when I was in my state of normal awareness, and I have described those teachings in all my accounts. In my state of normal awareness, Don Juan told me that he was a sorcerer. He even introduced me to another sorcerer, Don Gennaro Flores. And because of the nature of our association, I logically concluded that they had taken me as their apprentice. That apprenticeship ended with an incomprehensible act that both Don Juan and Don Gennaro led me to perform. They made me jump from the top of a flat mountain into an abyss. I have described in one of my accounts what took place on that mountaintop. The last drama of Don Juan's teachings for the right side was played there by Don Juan himself, Don Gennaro, two apprentices, Pablito and Nestor, and me. Pablito, Nestor, and I jumped from that mountaintop into an abyss. For years afterward, I thought that just my total trust in Don Juan and Don Gennaro had been sufficient to obliterate all my rational fears on facing actual annihilation. I know now that it wasn't so. I know that the secret was in Don Juan's teachings for the left side, and that it took tremendous discipline and perseverance for Don Juan, Don Gennaro, and their companions to conduct those teachings. It has taken me nearly 10 years to recollect what exactly took place in his teachings for the left side that led me to be so willing to perform such an incomprehensible act, jumping into an abyss. It was in his teachings for the left side that Don Juan led on what he, Don Gennaro, and their companions were really doing to me, and who they were. They were not teaching me sorcery, but how to master 3 aspects of an ancient knowledge they possessed: awareness, stalking, and intent. And they were not sorcerers, they were seers. And Don Juan was not only a seer, but also a Nahual. Don Juan had already explained to me, in his teachings for the right side, a great deal about the Nahual and about seeing. I had understood seeing to be the capacity of human beings to enlarge their perceptual field until they are capable of assessing not only the outer appearances, but the essence of everything. He had also explained that seers see man as a field of energy, which looks like a luminous egg. The majority of people, he said, have their fields of energy divided into two parts. A few men and women have 4 or sometimes 3 parts. Because these people are more resilient than the average man, they can become nawals after learning to see. In his teachings for the left side, Don Juan explained to me the intricacies of seeing and of being a nawal. To be a nawal, he said, is something more complex and far-reaching than being merely a more resilient man who has learned to see. To be a nawal entails being a leader, being a teacher, and a guide. As a nawal, Don Juan was the leader of a group of seers known as the Nawal's Party, which was composed of 8 female seers: Cecilia, Delia, Hermelinda, Carmela, Nelida, Florinda, Zulica, and Zoila. 3 male seers: Vicente, Silvio Manuel, and Gennaro, and 4 couriers, or messengers: Emilito, John Tuma, Marta, and Teresa. In addition to leading the Nawal's Party, Don Juan also taught and guided a group of apprentice seers known as the New Nawal's Party. It consisted of 4 young men: Pablito, Nestor, Eligio, and Benigno, along with 5 women: Soledad, La Gorda, Lydia, Josefina, and Rosa. I was the nominal leader of the New Nawal's Party, together with a Nawal woman, Carol. In order for Don Juan to impart to me his teachings for the left side, it was necessary for me to enter into a unique state of perceptual clarity, known as heightened awareness. Throughout the years of my association with him, he had me repeatedly shift into such a state by means of a blow that he delivered with the palm of his hand on my upper back. Don Juan explained that in a state of heightened awareness, apprentices can behave almost as naturally as in everyday life, but can bring their minds to focus on anything with uncommon force and clarity. Yet, an inherent quality of heightened awareness is that it is not susceptible to normal recall. What transpires in such a state becomes part of the apprentice's everyday awareness only through a staggering effort of recovery. My interaction with the Nawal's Party was an example of this difficulty of recall. With the exception of Don Gennaro, I had contact with them only when I was in a state of heightened awareness. Hence, in my normal everyday life, I could not remember them, not even as vague characters in dreams. The manner in which I met with them every time was almost a ritual. I would drive to Don Gennaro's house in a small town in the southern part of Mexico. Don Juan would join us immediately, and the 3 of us would then get busy with Don Juan's teachings for the right side. After that, Don Juan would make me change levels of awareness. And then we would drive to a larger, nearby town where he and the other 15 Seers were living. Every time I entered into heightened awareness, I could not cease marveling at the difference between my two sides. I always felt as if a veil had been lifted from my eyes, as if I had been partially blind before, and now I could see. The freedom, the sheer joy that used to possess me on those occasions cannot be compared with anything else I have ever experienced. Yet at the same time, there was a frightening feeling of sadness and longing that went hand in hand with that freedom and joy. Don Juan had told me that there is no completeness without sadness and longing, for without them there is no sobriety, no kindness. Wisdom without kindness, he said, and knowledge without sobriety are useless. The organization of his teachings for the left side also required that Don Juan, together with some of his fellow seers, explain to me the three facets of their knowledge: the mastery of awareness, the mastery of stalking, and the mastery of intent. This work deals with the mastery of awareness, which is part of his total set of teachings for the left side. The set he used in order to prepare me for performing the astonishing act of jumping into an abyss. Due to the fact that the experiences I narrate here took place in heightened awareness, they cannot have the texture of daily life. They are lacking in worldly context, although I have tried my best to supply it without fictionalizing it. In heightened awareness, one is minimally conscious of the surroundings, because one's total concentration is taken by the details of the action at hand. In this case, the action at hand was naturally the elucidation of the mastery of awareness. Don Juan understood the mastery of awareness as being the modern-day version of an extremely old tradition, which he called the tradition of the ancient Toltec Seers. Although he felt that he was inextricably linked to that old tradition, he considered himself to be one of the Seers of a new cycle. When I asked him once what was the essential character of the Seers of the new cycle, he said that they are the warriors of total freedom, that they are such masters of awareness, stalking, and intent, that they are not caught by death like the rest of mortal men, but choose the moment and the way of their departure from this world. At that moment they are consumed by a fire from within and vanish from the face of the earth, free as if they had never existed. Chapter 1. The New Seers. I had arrived in the city of Oaxaca in southern Mexico on my way to the mountains to look for Don Juan. On my way out of town in the early morning, I had the good sense to drive by the main square. And there I found him, sitting on his favorite bench, as if waiting for me to go by. I joined him. He told me that he was in the city on business, that he was staying at a local boarding house, and that I was welcome to stay with him because he had to remain in town for 2 more days. We talked for a while about my activities and problems in the academic world. As was customary with him, he suddenly hit me on my back when I least expected it, and the blow shifted me into a state of heightened awareness. We sat in silence for a very long time. I anxiously waited for him to begin talking. Yet when he did, he caught me by surprise. Ages before the Spaniards came to Mexico, he said, there were extraordinary Toltec seers, men capable of inconceivable deeds. They were the last link in a chain of knowledge that extended over thousands of years. The Toltec seers were extraordinary men, powerful sorcerers, somber, driven men who unraveled mysteries and possessed secret knowledge that they used to influence and victimize people by fixating the awareness of their victims on whatever they chose. He stopped talking and looked at me intently. I felt that he was waiting for me to ask a question, but I did not know what to ask. I have to emphasize an important fact, he continued. The fact that those sorcerers knew how to fixate the awareness of their victims. You didn't pick up on that. When I mentioned it, it didn't mean anything to you. That's not surprising. One of the hardest things to acknowledge is that awareness can be manipulated. I felt confused. I knew that he was leading me towards something. I felt a familiar apprehension, the same feeling I had whenever he began a new round of his teachings. I told him how I felt. He smiled vaguely. Usually when he smiled, he exuded happiness. This time he was definitely preoccupied. He seemed to consider for a moment whether or not to go on talking. He stared at me intently again, slowly moving his gaze over the entire length of my body. Then, apparently satisfied, he nodded and said that I was ready for my final exercise, something that all warriors go through before considering themselves fit to be on their own. I was more mystified than ever. We are going to talk about awareness, he continued. The Toltec seers knew the art of handling awareness. As a matter of fact, they were the supreme masters of that art. When I say that they knew how to fixate the awareness of their victims, I mean that their secret knowledge and secret practices allowed them to pry open the mystery of being aware. Enough of their practices have survived to this day, but fortunately in a modified form. I say fortunately because those activities, as I will explain, did not lead the ancient Toltec seers to freedom, but to their doom. Do you know those practices yourself? I asked. Why, certainly, he replied. There is no way for us to know those techniques. There is no way for us not to know those techniques. But that doesn't mean that we practice them ourselves. We have other views. We belong to a new cycle. But you don't consider yourself a sorcerer, Don Juan, do you? I asked. No, I don't, he said. I am a warrior who sees. In fact, all of us are los nuevos videntes, the new seers. The old seers were the sorcerers. For the average man, he continued, sorcery is a negative business, but it is fascinating all the same. That's why I encouraged you, in your normal awareness, to think of us as sorcerers. It's advisable to do so. It serves to attract interest. But for us to be sorcerers would be like entering into a dead-end street. I wanted to know what he meant by that, but he refused to talk about it. He said that he would elaborate on the subject as he proceeded with his explanation of awareness. I asked him then about the origin of the Toltec's knowledge. The way the Toltecs first started on the path of knowledge was by eating power plants, he replied. Whether prompted by curiosity or hunger or error, they ate them. Once the power plants had produced their effects on them, it was only a matter of time before some of them began to analyze their experiences. In my opinion, the first men on the path of knowledge were very daring, but very mistaken. Isn't all this a conjecture on your part, Don Juan? No, this is no conjecture of mine. I am a seer, and when I focus my seeing on that time, I know everything that took place. Can you see the details of things of the past? I asked. Seeing is a peculiar feeling of knowing, he replied. Of knowing something without a shadow of doubt. In this case, I know what those men did. Not only because of my seeing, but because we are so closely bound together. Don Juan explained then that his use of the term Toltec did not correspond to what I understood it to mean. To me, it meant a culture, the Toltec Empire. To him, the term Toltec meant man of knowledge. He said that in the time he was referring to, centuries or perhaps even millennia before the Spanish conquest, all such men of knowledge lived within a vast geographical area, north and south of the Valley of Mexico, and were employed in specific lines of work: curing, bewitching, storytelling, dancing, being an oracle, preparing food and drink. Those lines of work fostered specific wisdom. Wisdom that distinguished them from average men. These Toltecs, moreover, were also people who fitted into the structure of everyday life, very much as doctors, artists, teachers, priests, and merchants in our own time do. They practiced their professions under the strict control of organized brotherhoods and became proficient and influential to such an extent that they even dominated groups of people who lived outside the Toltec's geographical regions. Don Juan said that after some of these men had finally learned to see, after centuries of dealing with power plants, the most enterprising of them then began to teach other men of knowledge how to see. And that was the beginning of their end. As time passed, the number of seers increased, but their obsession with what they saw, which filled them with reverence and fear, became so intense that they ceased to be men of knowledge. They became extraordinarily proficient in seeing and could exert great control over the strange worlds they were witnessing. But it was to no avail. Seeing had undermined their strength and forced them to be obsessed with what they saw. There were seers, however, who escaped that fate. Don Juan continued. Great men who, in spite of their seeing, never ceased to be men of knowledge. Some of them endeavored to use seeing positively and to teach it to their fellow men. I'm convinced that under their direction, the populations of entire cities went into other worlds and never came back. But the seers who could only see were fiascos. And when the land where they lived was invaded by a conquering people, they were as defenseless as everyone else. Those conquerors, he went on, took over the Toltec world. They appropriated everything, but they never learned to see. Why do you think they never learned to see? I asked. Because they copied the procedures of the Toltec seers without having the Toltec's inner knowledge. To this day, there are scores of sorcerers all over Mexico, descendants of those conquerors, who follow the Toltec ways but don't know what they're doing or what they're talking about because they're not seers. Who were those conquerors, Don Juan? Other Indians, he said. When the Spaniards came, the old seers had been gone for centuries. But there was a new breed of seers who were starting to secure their place in a new cycle. What do you mean, a new breed of seers? After the world of the first Toltecs was destroyed, the surviving seers retreated and began a serious examination of their practices. The first thing they did was to establish stalking, dreaming, and intent as the key procedures and to de-emphasize the use of power plants. Perhaps that gives us a hint as to what really happened to them with power plants. The new cycle was just beginning to take hold when the Spanish conquerors swept the land. Fortunately, by that time, the new seers were thoroughly prepared to face that danger. They were already consummate practitioners of the art of stalking. Don Juan said that the subsequent centuries of subjugation provided for these new seers the ideal circumstances in which to perfect their skills. Oddly enough, it was the extreme rigor and coercion of that period that gave them the impetus to refine their new principles. And, owing to the fact that they never divulged their activities, they were left alone to map their findings. Were there a great many new seers during the conquest? I asked. At the beginning there were. Near the end, there were only a handful. The rest had been exterminated. What about in our day, Don Juan? I asked. There are a few. They are scattered all over, you understand. Do you know them? I asked. Such a simple question is the hardest one to answer, he replied. There are some we know very well, but they are not exactly like us because they have concentrated on other aspects of knowledge, such as dancing, curing, bewitching, talking, instead of what the new seers recommend, stalking, dreaming, and intent. Those who are exactly like us would not cross our path. The seers who lived during the conquest set it up that way so as to avoid being exterminated in the confrontation with the Spaniards. Each of those seers founded a lineage, and not all of them had descendants, so the lines are few. Do you know any who are exactly like us? I asked. A few, he replied laconically. I asked him then to give me all the information he could, for I was vitally interested in the topic. To me, it was of crucial importance to know names and addresses for purposes of validation or corroboration. Don Juan did not seem inclined to oblige me. The new seers went through that bit of corroboration, he said. Half of them left their bones in the corroborating room. So now they are solitary birds. Let's leave it that way. All we can talk about is our line. About that, you and I can say as much as we please. He explained that all the lines of seers were started at the same time and in the same fashion. Around the end of the 16th century, every Nawal deliberately isolated himself and his group of seers from any overt contact with other seers. The consequence of that drastic segregation, he said, was the formation of the individual lineages. Our lineage consisted of 14 Nawals and 126 seers, he said. Some of those 14 Nawals had as few as 7 seers with them. Others had 11, and some up to 15. He told me that his teacher, or his benefactor, as he called him, was the Nawal Julian, and the one who came before Julian was the Nawal Elias. I asked him if he knew the names of all 14 Nawals. He named and enumerated them for me so I could learn who they were. He also said that he had personally known the 15 Seers who formed his benefactor's group, and that he had also known his benefactor's teacher, the Nawal Elias, and the 11 Seers of his party. Don Juan assured me that our line was quite exceptional because it underwent a drastic change in the year 1723 as a result of an outside influence that came to bear on us and inexorably altered our course. He did not want to discuss the event itself at the moment, but he said that a new beginning is counted from that time, and that the 8 Nawals who have ruled the line since then are considered intrinsically different from the 6 who preceded them. Don Juan must have had business to take care of the next day, for I did not see him until around noon. In the meantime, 3 of his apprentices had come to town: Pablito, Nestor, and La Gorda. They were shopping for tools and materials for Pablito's carpentry business. I accompanied them and helped them to complete all their errands. Then all of us went back to the boarding house. All 4 of us were sitting around talking when Don Juan came into my room. He announced that we were leaving after lunch, but that before we went to eat, he still had something to discuss with me in private. He wanted the 2 of us to take a stroll around the main square, and then all of us would meet at a restaurant. Pablito and Nestor stood up and said that they had some errands to run before meeting us. La Gorda seemed very displeased. "What are you going to talk about?" she blurted out, but quickly realized her mistake and giggled. Don Juan gave her a strange look, but did not say anything. Encouraged by his silence, La Gorda proposed that we take her along. She assured us that she would not bother us in the least. "I'm sure you won't bother us," Don Juan said to her, "but I really don't want you to hear anything of what I have to say to him." La Gorda's anger was very obvious. She blushed, and as Don Juan and I walked out of the room, her entire face clouded with anxiety and tension, becoming instantly distorted. Her mouth was open and her lips were dry. La Gorda's mood made me very apprehensive. I felt an actual discomfort. I didn't say anything, but Don Juan seemed to notice my feelings. "You should thank La Gorda day and night," he said all of a sudden. "She's helping you destroy your self-importance. She's the petty tyrant in your life, but you still haven't caught on to that." We strolled around the plaza until all my nervousness had vanished. Then we sat down on his favorite bench again. "The ancient Seers were very fortunate indeed," Don Juan began, "because they had plenty of time to learn marvelous things. Let me tell you, they knew wonders that we can't even imagine today. Who taught them all that? I asked. They learned everything by themselves, through seeing, he replied. Most of the things we know in our lineage were figured out by them. The new seers corrected the mistakes of the old seers, but the basis of what we know and do is lost in Toltec time. He explained, one of the simplest and yet most important findings from the point of view of instruction, he said, is the knowledge that man has two types of awareness. The old seers called them the right and the left side of man. The old seers figured out, he went on, that the best way to teach their knowledge was to make their apprentices shift to their left side to a state of heightened awareness. Real learning takes place there. Very young children were given to the old seers as apprentices, Don Juan continued, so that they wouldn't know any other way of life. Those children, in turn, when they came of age, took other children as apprentices. Imagine the things they must have uncovered in their shifts to the left and to the right after centuries of that kind of concentration. I remarked how disconcerting those shifts were to me. He said that my experience was similar to his own. His benefactor, the Nahual Julian, had created a profound schism in him by making him shift back and forth from one type of awareness to the other. He said that the clarity and freedom he experienced in heightened awareness were in total contrast to the rationalizations, the defenses, the anger, and the fear of his normal state of awareness. The old seers used to create this polarity to suit their own particular purposes. With it, they forced their apprentices to achieve the concentration needed to learn sorcery techniques. But the new seers, he said, use it to lead their apprentices to the conviction that there are unrealized possibilities in man. The best effort of the new seers, Don Juan continued, is their explanation of the mystery of awareness. They condensed it all into some concepts and actions which are taught while the apprentices are in heightened awareness. He said that the value of the new seer's method of teaching is that it takes advantage of the fact that no one can remember anything that happens while being in a state of heightened awareness. This inability to remember sets up an almost insurmountable barrier for warriors, who have to recollect all the instruction given to them if they are to go on. Only after years of struggle and discipline can warriors recollect their instruction. By then, the concepts and the procedures that they were taught to them have been internalized and have thus acquired the force the new seers meant them to have. Chapter 2. Petty Tyrants. Don Juan did not discuss the mastery of awareness with me until months later. We were, at that time, in the house where the Nahual's party lived. "Let's go for a walk," Don Juan said to me, placing his hand on my shoulder. "Or better yet, let's go to the town square, where there are a lot of people, and sit down and talk." I was surprised when he spoke to me, as I had been in the house for a couple of days then, and he had not said so much as hello. As Don Juan and I were leaving the house, La Gorda intercepted us and demanded that we take her along. She determined not to take no for an answer. Don Juan, in a very stern voice, told her that he had to discuss something in private with me. "You're going to talk about me," La Gorda said, her tone and gestures betraying both suspicion and annoyance. "You're right," Don Juan replied dryly. He moved past her without turning to look at her. I followed him, and we walked in silence to the town square. When we sat down, I asked him what on earth we would find to discuss about La Gorda. I was still smarting from her look of menace when we left the house. "We have nothing to discuss about La Gorda or anybody else," he said. I told her that just to provoke her enormous self-importance, and it worked. She is furious with us. If I know her, by now she will have talked to herself long enough to have built up her confidence and her righteous indignation at having been refused and made to look like a fool. I wouldn't be surprised if she barges in on us here at the park bench. "If we're not going to talk about La Gorda, what are we going to discuss?" I asked. "We're going to continue the discussion we started in Oaxaca," he replied. "To understand the explanation of awareness will require your utmost effort and your willingness to shift back and forth between levels of awareness. While we are involved in our discussion, I will demand your total concentration and patience." Half complaining, I told him that he had made me feel very uncomfortable by refusing to talk to me for the past 2 days. He looked at me and arched his brows. A smile played on his lips and vanished. I realized that he was letting me know I was no better than La Gorda. "I was provoking your self-importance," he said with a frown. "Self-importance is our greatest enemy. Think about it. What weakens us is feeling offended by the deeds and misdeeds of our fellow men. Our self-importance requires that we spend most of our lives offended by someone. The new Seers recommended that every effort should be made to eradicate self-importance from the lives of warriors. I have followed that recommendation, and much of my endeavors with you has been geared to show you that without self-importance, we are invulnerable." As I listened, his eyes suddenly became very shiny. I was thinking to myself that he seemed to be on the verge of laughter, and there was no reason for it, when I was startled by an abrupt, painful slap on the right side of my face. I jumped up from the bench. La Gorda was standing behind me, her hand still raised. Her face was flushed with anger. "Now you can say what you like about me, and with more justification," she shouted. "If you have anything to say, however, say it to my face." Her outburst appeared to have exhausted her, because she sat down on the cement and began to weep. Don Juan was transfixed with inexpressible glee. I was frozen with sheer fury. La Gorda glared at me and then turned to Don Juan and meekly told him that we had no right to criticize her. Don Juan laughed so hard he doubled over almost to the ground. He couldn't even speak. He tried 2 or 3 times to say something to me, then finally got up and walked away, his body still shaking with spasms of laughter. I was about to run after him, still glowering at La Gorda. At that moment, I found her despicable, when something extraordinary happened to me. I realized what Don Juan had found so hilarious. La Gorda and I were horrendously alike. Our self-importance was monumental. My surprise and fury at being slapped were just like La Gorda's feelings of anger and suspicion. Don Juan was right. The burden of self-importance is a terrible encumbrance. I ran after him then, elated, the tears flowing down my cheeks. I caught up with him and told him what I had realized. His eyes were shining with mischievousness and delight. "What should I do about La Gorda?" I asked. "Nothing," he replied. "Realizations are always personal." He changed the subject and said that the omens were telling us to continue our discussion back at his house, either in a large room with comfortable chairs or in the back patio, which had a roofed corridor around it. He said that whenever he conducted his explanation inside the house, those 2 areas would be off limits to everyone else. We went back to the house. Don Juan told everyone what La Gorda had done. The delight all the seers showed in taunting her made La Gorda's position extremely uncomfortable. Self-importance can't be fought with niceties, Don Juan commented when I expressed my concern about La Gorda. He then asked everyone to leave the room. We sat down, and Don Juan began his explanation. He said that seers, old and new, are divided into 2 categories. The first one is made up of those who are willing to exercise self-restraint and can channel their activities toward pragmatic goals, which would benefit other seers and man in general. The other category consists of those who don't care about self-restraint or about any pragmatic goals. It is the consensus among seers that the latter have failed to resolve the problem of self-importance. Self-importance is not something simple and naive, he explained. On the one hand, it is the core of everything that is good in us, and on the other hand, the core of everything that is rotten To get rid of the self-importance that is rotten requires a masterpiece of strategy. Seers through the ages have given the highest praise to those who have accomplished it. I complained that the idea of eradicating self-importance, although very appealing to me at times, was really incomprehensible. I told him that I found his directives for getting rid of it so vague I could not follow them. I've said to you many times, he said, that in order to follow the path of knowledge, one has to be very imaginative. You see, in the path of knowledge, nothing is as clear as we'd like it to be. My discomfort made me argue that his admonitions about self-importance reminded me of Catholic dictums. After a lifetime of being told about the evils of sin, I had become callous. Warriors fight self-importance as a matter of strategy, not principle, he replied. Your mistake is to understand what I say in terms of morality. I see you as a highly moral man, Don Juan, I insisted. You've noticed my impeccability, that's all, he said. Impeccability, as well as getting rid of self-importance, is too vague a concept to be of any value to me, I remarked. Don Juan choked with laughter, and I challenged him to explain impeccability. Impeccability is nothing else but the proper use of energy, he said. My statements have no inkling of morality. I've saved energy, and that makes me impeccable. To understand this, you have to save enough energy yourself. We were quiet for a long time. I wanted to think about what he had said. Suddenly, he started talking again. Warriors take strategic inventories, he said. They list everything they do. Then they decide which of those things can be changed in order to allow themselves a respite in terms of expending their energy. I argued that their list would have to include everything under the sun. He patiently answered that the strategic inventory he was talking about covered only behavioral patterns that were not essential to our survival and well-being. I jumped at the opportunity to point out that survival and well-being were categories that could be interpreted in endless ways. Hence, there was no way of agreeing what was or was not essential to survival and well-being. As I kept on talking, I began to lose momentum. Finally, I stopped because I realized the futility of my arguments. Don Juan said then that in the strategic inventories of warriors, self-importance figures as the activity that consumes the greatest amount of energy, hence their effort to eradicate it. One of the first concerns of warriors is to free that energy in order to face the unknown with it, Don Juan went on. The action of rechanneling that energy is impeccability. He said that the most effective strategy was worked out by the Seers of the conquest the unquestionable masters of stalking. It consists of 6 elements that interplay with one another. 5 of them are called the attributes of warriorship: control, discipline, forbearance, timing, and will. They pertain to the world of the warrior who is fighting to lose self-importance. The 6th element, which is perhaps the most important of all, pertains to the outside world and is called the Petty Tyrant. He looked at me as if silently asking me whether or not I had understood. "I'm really mystified," I said. "You keep on saying that La Gorda is the petty tyrant of my life. Just what is a petty tyrant?" "A petty tyrant is a tormentor," he replied. "Someone who either holds the power of life and death over warriors or simply annoys them to distraction." Don Juan had a beaming smile as he spoke to me. He said that the new Seers developed their own classification of petty tyrants. Although the concept is one of their most serious and important findings, the new Seers had a sense of humor about it. He assured me that there was a tinge of malicious humor in every one of their classifications, because humor was the only means of counteracting the compulsion of human awareness to take inventories and to make cumbersome classifications. The new Seers, in accordance with their practice, saw fit to head their classification with the primal source of energy, the one and only ruler in the universe, and they called it simply the Tyrant. The rest of the despots and authoritarians were found to be, naturally, infinitely below the category of tyrant. Compared to the source of everything, the most fearsome, tyrannical men are buffoons. Consequently, they were classified as petty tyrants. Pinches tiranos. He said that there were 2 subclasses of minor petty tyrants. The first subclass consisted of the petty tyrants who persecute and inflict misery, but without actually causing anybody's death. They were called little petty tyrants, pinches tiranitos. The second consisted of the petty tyrants who are only exasperating and bothersome to no end. They were called small fry petty tyrants, repinches tiranitos, or teensy-weensy petty tyrants, pinches tiranitos chiquititos. I thought his classifications were ludicrous. I was sure that he was improvising the Spanish terms. I asked him if that was so. "Not at all," he replied with an amused expression. The new Seers were great ones for classifications. Gennaro is doubtless one of the greatest. If you'd observe him carefully, you'd realize exactly how the new Seers feel about their classifications. He laughed uproariously at my confusion when I asked him if he was pulling my leg. "I wouldn't dream of doing that," he said, smiling. "Gennaro may do that, but not I. especially when I know how you feel about classifications. It's just that the new seers were terribly irreverent. He added that the little petty tyrants are further divided into 4 categories. One that torments with brutality and violence. Another that does it by creating unbearable apprehension through deviousness. Another which oppresses with sadness. And the last which torments by making warriors rage. La Gorda is in a class of her own, he added. She is an acting, small fry petty tyrant. She annoys you to pieces and makes you rage. She even slaps you. With all that, she is teaching you detachment. That's not possible, I protested. You haven't yet put together all the ingredients of the new seer's strategy, he said. Once you do that, you'll know how efficient and clever is the device of using a petty tyrant. I would certainly say that the strategy not only gets rid of self-importance, it also prepares warriors for the final realization that impeccability is the only thing that counts in the path of knowledge. He said that what the new seers had in mind was a deadly maneuver in which the petty tyrant is like a mountain peak and the attributes of warriorship are like climbers who meet at the summit. Usually, only 4 attributes are played, he went on. The 5th, will, is always saved for an ultimate confrontation, when warriors are facing the firing squad, so to speak. Why is it done that way? Because will belongs to another sphere, the unknown. The other 4 belong to the known, exactly where the petty tyrants are lodged. In fact, what turns human beings into petty tyrants is precisely the obsessive manipulation of the known. Don Juan explained that the interplay of all the 5 attributes of warriorship is done only by seers who are also impeccable warriors and have mastery over will. Such an interplay is a supreme maneuver that cannot be performed on the daily human stage. 4 attributes are all that is needed to deal with the worst of petty tyrants, he continued. Provided, of course, that a petty tyrant has been found. As I said, the petty tyrant is the outside element, the one we cannot control, and the element that is perhaps the most important of them all. My benefactor used to say that the warrior who stumbles on a petty tyrant is a lucky one. He meant that you're fortunate if you come upon one in your path, because if you don't, you have to go out and look for one. He explained that one of the greatest accomplishments of the Seers of the Conquest was a construct he called the 3-phase progression. By understanding the nature of man, they were able to reach the incontestable conclusion that if seers can hold their own in facing petty tyrants, they can certainly face the unknown with impunity. And then they can even stand the presence of the unknowable. The average man's reaction is to think that the order of that statement should be reversed, he went on. A seer who can hold his own in the face of the unknown can certainly face petty tyrants. But that's not so. What destroyed the superb seers of ancient times was that assumption. We know better now. We know that nothing can temper the spirit of a warrior as much as the challenge of dealing with impossible people in positions of power. Only under those conditions can warriors acquire the sobriety and serenity to stand the pressure of the unknowable. I vociferously disagreed with him. I told him that in my opinion, tyrants can only render their victims helpless or make them as brutal as they themselves are. I pointed out that countless studies had been done on the effects of physical and psychological torture on such victims. The difference is in something you just said, he retorted. They are victims, not warriors. Once I felt just as you do. I'll tell you what made me change. But first, let's go back again to what I said about the conquest. The seers of that time couldn't have found better ground. The Spaniards were the petty tyrants who tested the seers' skills to the limit. After dealing with the conquerors, the seers were capable of facing anything. They were the lucky ones. At that time, there were petty tyrants everywhere. After all those marvelous years of abundance, things changed a great deal. Petty tyrants never again had that scope. It was only during those times that their authority was unlimited. The perfect ingredient for the making of a superb seer is a petty tyrant with unlimited prerogatives. In our times, unfortunately, seers have to go to extremes to find a worthy one. Most of the time, they have to be satisfied with very small fry. Did you find a petty tyrant yourself, Don Juan? I was lucky. A king-size one found me. At the time, though, I felt like you. I couldn't consider myself fortunate. Don Juan said that his ordeal began a few weeks before he met his benefactor. He was barely 20 years old at the time. He had gotten a job at a sugar mill, working as a laborer. He had always been very strong, so it was easy for him to get jobs that required muscle. One day, when he was moving some heavy sacks of sugar, a woman came by. She was very well dressed and seemed to be a woman of means. She was perhaps in her 50s, Don Juan said, and very domineering. She looked at Don Juan and then spoke to the foreman and left. Don Juan was then approached by the foreman, who told him that for a fee he would recommend him for a job in the boss's house. Don Juan told the man that he had no money. The foreman smiled and said not to worry, because he would have plenty on payday. He patted Don Juan's back and assured him it was a great honor to work for the boss. Don Juan said that being a lowly, ignorant Indian, living hand to mouth, not only did he believe every word, he thought a good fairy had touched him. He promised to pay the foreman anything he wished. The foreman named a large sum, which had to be paid in installments. Immediately thereafter, the foreman himself took Don Juan to the house, which was quite a distance from the town, and left him there with another foreman, a huge, somber, ugly man who asked a lot of questions. He wanted to know about Don Juan's family. Don Juan answered that he didn't have any. The man was so pleased that he even smiled through his rotten teeth. He promised Don Juan that they would pay him plenty, and that he would even be in a position to save money, because he didn't have to spend any, for he was going to live and eat in the house. The way the man laughed was terrifying. Don Juan knew that he had to escape immediately. He ran for the gate, but the man cut in front of him with a revolver in his hand. He cocked it and rammed it into Don Juan's stomach. "You're here to work yourself to the bone," he said, "and don't you forget it." He shoved Don Juan around with a billy club. Then he took him to the side of the house, and, after observing that he worked his men every day from sunrise to sunset without a break, he put Don Juan to work, digging out 2 enormous tree stumps. He also told Don Juan that if he ever tried to escape or went to the authorities, he would shoot him dead, and that if Don Juan should ever get away, he would swear in court that Don Juan had tried to murder the boss. "You'll work here until you die," he said. "Another Indian will get your job then, just as you're taking a dead Indian's place." Don Juan said that the house looked like a fortress, with armed men with machetes everywhere. So he got busy working and tried not to think about his predicament. At the end of the day, the man came back and kicked him all the way to the kitchen, because he did not like the defiant look in Don Juan's eyes. He threatened to cut the tendons of Don Juan's arms if he didn't obey him. In the kitchen, an old woman brought food, but Don Juan was so upset and afraid that he couldn't eat. The old woman advised him to eat as much as he could. He had to be strong, she said, because his work would never end. She warned him that the man who had held his job had died just a day earlier. He was too weak to work and had fallen from a second-story window. Don Juan said that he had worked at the boss's place for 3 weeks, and that the man bullied him every moment of every day. He made him work under the most dangerous conditions, doing the heaviest work imaginable, under the constant threat of his knife, gun, or billy club. He sent him daily to the stables to clean the stalls, while the nervous stallions were in them. At the beginning of every day, Don Juan thought it would be his last one on earth, and surviving meant only that he had to go through the same hell again the next day. What precipitated the end was Don Juan's request to have some time off. The pretext was that he needed to go to town to pay the foreman of the sugar mill the money that he owed him. The other foreman retorted that Don Juan could not stop working, not even for a minute, because he was in debt up to his ears just for the privilege of working there. Don Juan knew that he was done for. He understood the man's maneuvers. Both he and the other foreman were in cahoots to get lowly Indians from the mill, work them to death, and divide their salaries. That realization angered him so intensely that he ran through the kitchen screaming and got inside the main house. The foreman and the other workers were caught totally by surprise. He ran out the front door and almost got away, but the foreman caught up with him on the road and shot him in the chest. He left him for dead. Don Juan said that it was not his destiny to die. His benefactor found him there and tended him until he got well. When I told my benefactor the whole story, Don Juan said, he could hardly contain his excitement. That foreman is really a prize, my benefactor said. He's too good to be wasted. Someday you must go back to that house. He raved about my luck in finding a 1 in a million petty tyrant with almost unlimited power. I thought the old man was nuts. It was years before I fully understood what he was talking about. That is one of the most horrible stories I have ever heard, I said. Did you really go back to that house? I certainly did, 3 years later. My benefactor was right. A petty tyrant like that was 1 in a million and couldn't be wasted. How did you manage to go back? My benefactor developed a strategy using the 4 attributes of warriorship: control, discipline, forbearance, and timing. Don Juan said that his benefactor, in explaining to him what he had to do to profit from facing that ogre of a man, also told him what the new Seers considered to be the 4 steps on the path of knowledge. The first step is the decision to become apprentices. After the apprentices change their views about themselves and the world, they take the second step and become warriors, which is to say, beings capable of the utmost discipline and control over themselves. The third step, after acquiring forbearance and timing, is to become men of knowledge. When men of knowledge learn to see, they have taken the 4th step and have become seers. His benefactor stressed the fact that Don Juan had been on the path of knowledge long enough to have acquired a minimum of the first 2 attributes: control and discipline. Don Juan emphasized that both of those attributes refer to an inner state. A warrior is self-oriented, not in a selfish way, but in the sense of a total and continuous examination of the self. At that time, I was barred from the other 2 attributes, Don Juan went on. Forbearance and timing are not quite an inner state. They are in the dominion of the man of knowledge, the domain. My benefactor showed them to me through his strategy. Does this mean that you couldn't have faced the petty tyrant by yourself? I asked. I'm sure that I could have done it myself, although I have always doubted that I would have carried it off with flair and joyfulness. My benefactor was simply enjoying the encounter by directing it. The idea of using a petty tyrant is not only for perfecting the warrior spirit, but also for enjoyment and happiness. How could anyone enjoy the monster you described? He was nothing in comparison to the real monsters that the new Seers faced during the conquest. By all indications, those Seers enjoyed themselves blue dealing with them. They proved that even the worst tyrants can bring delight, provided, of course, that one is a warrior. Don Juan explained that the mistake average men make in confronting petty tyrants is not to have a strategy to fall back on. The fatal flaw is that average men take themselves too seriously. Their actions and feelings, as well as those of the petty tyrants, are all important. Warriors, on the other hand, not only have a well thought out strategy, but are free from self-importance. What restrains their self-importance is that they have understood that reality is an interpretation we make. That knowledge was the definitive advantage that the new Seers had over the simple-minded Spaniards. He said that he became convinced he could defeat the foreman using only the single realization that petty tyrants take themselves with deadly seriousness, while warriors do not. Following his benefactor's strategic plan, therefore, Don Juan got a job in the same sugar mill as before. Nobody remembered that he had worked there in the past. Peons came to that sugar mill and left it without leaving a trace. His benefactor's strategy specified that Don Juan had to be solicitous of whoever came to look for another victim. As it happened, the same woman came and spotted him, as she had done years ago. This time, he was physically even stronger than before. The same routine took place. The strategy, however, called for refusing payment to the foreman from the outset. The man had never been turned down and was taken aback. He threatened to fire Don Juan from the job. Don Juan threatened him back, saying that he would go directly to the lady's house and see her. Don Juan knew that the woman, who was the wife of the owner of the mill, did not know what the two foremen were up to. He told the foreman that he knew where she lived, because he had worked in the surrounding fields, cutting sugarcane. The man began to haggle, and Don Juan demanded money from him before he would accept going to the lady's house. The foreman gave in and handed him a few bills. Don Juan was perfectly aware that the foreman's acquiescence was just a ruse to get him to go to the house. He himself, once again, took me to the house, Don Juan said. It was an old hacienda owned by the people of the sugar mill. Rich men who either knew what was going on and didn't care, or were too indifferent even to notice. As soon as we got there, I ran into the house to look for the lady. I found her and dropped to my knees and kissed her hand to thank her. The two foremen were livid. The foreman at the house followed the same pattern as before, but I had the proper equipment to deal with him. I had control, discipline, forbearance, and timing. It turned out as my benefactor had planned it. My control made me fulfill the man's most asinine demands. What usually exhausts us in a situation like that is the wear and tear on our self-importance. Any man who has an iota of pride is ripped apart by being made to feel worthless. I gladly did everything he asked of me. I was joyful and strong, and I didn't give a fig about my pride or my fear. I was there as an impeccable warrior. To tune the spirit when someone is trampling on you is called control. Don Juan explained that his benefactor's strategy required that instead of feeling sorry for himself, as he had done before, he immediately go to work mapping the man's strong points, his weaknesses, his quirks of behavior. He found that the foreman's strongest points were his violent nature and his daring. He had shot Don Juan in broad daylight and in sight of scores of onlookers. His great weakness was that he liked his job and did not want to endanger it. Under no circumstances could he attempt to kill Don Juan inside the compound in the daytime. His other weakness was that he was a family man. He had a wife and children who lived in a shack near the house. To gather all this information while they are beating you up is called discipline, Don Juan said. The man was a regular fiend. He had no saving grace. According to the new Seers, a perfect petty tyrant has no redeeming feature. Don Juan said that the other two attributes of warriorship, forbearance and timing, which he did not yet have, had been automatically included in his benefactor's strategy. Forbearance is to wait patiently, no rush, no anxiety, a simple, joyful holding back of what is due. I groveled daily, Don Juan continued, sometimes crying under the man's whip, and yet I was happy. My benefactor's strategy was what made me go from day to day without hating the man's guts. I was a warrior. I knew that I was waiting, and I knew what I was waiting for. Right there is the great joy of warriorship. He added that his benefactor's strategy called for a systematic harassment of the man by taking cover with a higher order, just as the seers of the new cycle had done during the conquest, by shielding themselves with the Catholic Church. A lowly priest was sometimes more powerful than a nobleman. Don Juan's shield was the lady who got him the job. He kneeled in front of her and called her a saint every time he saw her. He begged her to give him the medallion of her patron saint so he could pray to him for her health and well-being. She gave me one, Don Juan went on, and that rattled the foreman to pieces. And when I got the servants to pray at night, he nearly had a heart attack. I think he decided then to kill me. He couldn't afford to let me go on. As a countermeasure, I organized a rosary among all the servants of the house. The lady thought I had the makings of a most pious man. I didn't sleep soundly after that, nor did I sleep in my bed. I climbed to the roof every night. From there I saw the man twice looking for me in the middle of the night with murder in his eyes. Daily he shoved me into the stallion's stalls, hoping that I would be crushed to death. But I had a plank of heavy boards that I braced against one of the corners and protected myself behind it. The man never knew because he was nauseated by the horses, another of his weaknesses, the deadliest of all, as things turned out. Don Juan said that timing is the quality that governs the release of all that is held back. Control, discipline, and forbearance are like a dam behind which everything is pulled. Timing is the gate in the dam. The man knew only violence, with which he terrorized. If his violence was neutralized, he was rendered nearly helpless. Don Juan knew that the man would not dare to kill him in view of the house. So one day, in the presence of the other workers, but in sight of his lady as well, Don Juan insulted the man. He called him a coward who was mortally afraid of the boss's wife. His benefactor's strategy had called for being on the alert for a moment like that and using it to turn the tables on the petty tyrant. Unexpected things always happen that way. The lowest of the slaves suddenly makes fun of the tyrant, taunts him, makes him feel ridiculous in front of significant witnesses, and then rushes away without giving the tyrant time to retaliate. A moment later, the man went crazy with rage, but I was already solicitously kneeling in front of the lady. He continued. Don Juan said that when the lady went inside the house, the man and his friends called him to the back, allegedly to do some work. The man was very pale, white with anger. From the sound of his voice, Don Juan knew what the man was really planning to do. Don Juan pretended to acquiesce, but instead of heading for the back, he ran for the stables. He trusted that the horses would make such a racket, the owners would come out to see what was wrong. He knew that the man would not dare shoot him. That would have been too noisy, and the man's fear of endangering his job was too overpowering. Don Juan also knew that the man would not go where the horses were. That is, unless he had been pushed beyond his endurance. I jumped inside the stall of the wildest stallion, Don Juan said. And the petty tyrant, blinded by rage, took out his knife and jumped in after me. I went instantly behind my planks. The horse kicked him once, and it was all over. I had spent 6 months in that house, and in that period of time, I had exercised the 4 attributes of warriorship. Thanks to them, I had succeeded. Not once had I felt sorry for myself or wept in impotence. I had been joyful and serene. My control and discipline were as keen as they'd ever been, and I had had a first-hand view of what forbearance and timing did for impeccable warriors. I had not once wished the man to die. My benefactor explains something very interesting. Forbearance means holding back with the spirit something that the warrior knows is rightfully due. It doesn't mean that a warrior goes around plotting to do anybody mischief or planning to settle past scores. Forbearance is something independent. As long as the warrior has control, discipline, and timing, forbearance assures giving whatever is due to whoever deserves it. Do petty tyrants sometimes win and destroy the warriors facing them? I asked. Of course. There was a time when warriors died like flies at the beginning of the conquest. Their ranks were decimated. The petty tyrants could put anyone to death, simply acting on a whim. Under that kind of pressure, seers reached sublime states. Don Juan said that was the time when the surviving seers had to exert themselves to the limit to find new ways. The new seers used petty tyrants, Don Juan said, staring at me fixedly. Not only to get rid of their self-importance, but to accomplish the very sophisticated maneuver of moving themselves out of this world. You'll understand that maneuver as we keep on discussing the mastery of awareness. I explained to Don Juan that what I had wanted to know was whether in the present, in our times, the petty tyrants he had called small fry could ever defeat a warrior. All the time, he replied. The consequences aren't as dire as those in the remote past. Today it goes without saying that warriors always have a chance to recuperate or to retrieve and come back later. But there is another side to this problem. To be defeated by a small fry petty tyrant is not deadly, but devastating. The degree of mortality, in a figurative sense, is almost as high. By that, I mean that warriors who succumb to a small fry petty tyrant are obliterated by their own sense of failure and unworthiness. That spells high mortality to me. How do you measure defeat? Anyone who joins the petty tyrant is defeated. To act in anger without control and discipline, to have no forbearance, is to be defeated. What happens after warriors are defeated? They either regroup themselves or they abandon the quest for knowledge and join the ranks of the petty tyrants for life.